Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Frances Fogel Story Strategist podcast. My name is Frances Fogel. I'm your host, and today I have Dave Allen, who is a new friend of mine. Was introduced to me via an old friend, Johnny Percy, of Met Film, and David is the director of Wilding, the film of Isabella Tree's seminal book about rewilding, which those of you who know me well will know is going to be a very joyous conversation for me. I hope it's going to be one for David. We've just had an interesting offline conversation about the concept of recording for an hour and not editing down, which hopefully we'll get into to some degree with David, who is an award-winning film producer, director, actually, I should say, of Passion Pictures, which is a 3-time Academy Award-winning full-service global animation and documentary production company. And so without any further ado, I'm going to ask David to tell us about how Passion Pictures came about, and then David, why wilding? How did that come about, and how has it been for you? So let's start with Passion Pictures. Thank you so much for being here. What is Passion Pictures? What does it mean to you?
Passion Pictures, we like to think of as a sort of studio. We do everything from big feature docs through lots of television documentaries. We also have a massive animation arm where we do long form and commercial animations. And I have an arm called Passion Planet, where we do a lot of natural history, science, and so what we call specialist factual programming. Across all formats, from theatrical to big landmark series to we're even doing a great sort of podcast thing, or not podcast, a sort of a thing for the internet at the moment, where we try and get the animals to talk back to us who are trying to be therapized over the trauma of becoming extinct. So that's what we love about ourselves. We do a bit of everything, and we just sort of do stuff for the passion of the project, really. And we've been doing it. My partner set it up 30 years ago, but Andrew Ruman, who runs the whole shebang, and then I've run Passion Planet within it.
So there must be a personal connection for you. Why, I mean, how did the work that you're doing, which is quite astounding, and I would encourage anyone who's new to Passion Pictures and their work to have a look at their lovely website, where you'll find a number of examples of the wide range of work that they do. And Passion Planet is a profound part of it that does some incredibly important educational work. What drew you to that personally?
I've always done natural history slightly outside the sort of blue chip environment. I've always sort of done natural history with people in the picture, I guess. And quite a long time ago, I tried to keep my work about slightly away from what might be, the chocolate box blue chip stuff, which just doesn't really kind of address the reality of what the world is like, I guess. So I've always been intrigued by these projects that have human stories within them and talk about the sort of natural world with humans in the picture. So we do quite a few amazing. Yeah, go on.
What was your background by way of personal experience with nature, whether that's a kind of formal education or a personal relationship with?
I had a house my parents had a house in the country which was completely off grid, and I was sort of down a mile-long dirt track with no electricity and no telly, and I used to spend summers down there, bored out of my brain, and the only fun I would get was going to sit in the woods trying to watch and photograph birds. I then trained as an architect and got through to go and do my postgrad, doing my 7-year process to become an architect. I thought, what do I really now want to do? And I wanted to go and film animals, and it sort of went from there. And I've been sort of doing it ever since. But as I say, very much from a documentary filming people point of view, rather than the biology of the animals point of view.
And was there always a kind of mission in mind that you can articulate now?
No, I don't think so. Always been very ambitious about making the first. No, I don't think I've had a mission in mind, but I absolutely, at some point, 10 or 12 years, 15 years ago, decided to move into a conservation angle on these shows for sure. But I've always been slightly averse to, I've always pushed to use my reputation to bring bigger budgets to those conservation shows. So we do some shows called, we did a show called Earth's New Wild and H2O, and we just done an Evolution Earth show that's going out on Sky at the moment, which are all, they have a much bigger budget through PBS and other broadcasters who come in on it to try and do conservation with a kind of, natural history budget, which is difficult to do, difficult to achieve.
Do you think that do you think those budgets come as a response to kind of public perceptions and public appetite, or is there a kind of an agenda on the part of those funding, a kind of sense of urgency, a sense of the need to bring awareness and use storytelling to something that feels much more important than ever?
It absolutely comes from a lack of interest from the public, completely and utterly. These days, there is very little responsibility provided. I mean, there hasn't been, other than the sort of, I guess, BBC, some of the public service broadcasters, less and less so. I mean, almost non-existently, I would say, but there is very little requirement at the bigger budget end, certainly, to tell it as it is. And the audience does not want to know. There are countless examples in our industry where shows get analyzed, and as soon as you start to tell them as it is, the viewership can literally drops off a cliff as they get told how bad it is out there. So it's a very difficult tightrope to watch, to keep your audience intrigued, interested, informed, without just getting them to turn off the telly.
Yeah, and for those of us who've been knocking about in and around some of the subjects that you produce films around, and I've been thinking about and working around for about 20 years myself, arguably we might be in a position to sort of navigate what I think people are now referring to as eco-anxiety a bit better, just because perhaps we're more hopeful, or we have a sense of what we might do about things, or what others can do about things, and how we can do them together. Do you see, or rather, how does that play out when I'm imagining there's a tension between wanting to produce, as you say, what people do want to see and they do want to hear about, and what it is that is actually the truth, is actually what needs to be seen. And how much does that occupy your mind in the here and now when you're actually directing something like Wilding, which obviously we're going to get onto soon?
I think a huge amount, but it's much more in the process of who's going to, first up, it's who's going to fund, so how you're going to get the money to make it, who's going to fund that project to get it on screen, and then how you're going to keep your audience with that message is a huge part of it. So you're trying to find a positivity to your message giving, but even that can feel like a bit of a con a lot of the time. But really, if you can find a great story, that is really your way in every time. People will stay for a good story. And there are some great stories out there around it. But the bigger picture, we tend to dress up with a kind of positivity, which is a which is also frightening because as you become part of the kind of lie in a way, the whole media machine becomes part of the lie because no one wants to hear the real down and dirty truth about some of this stuff. But anyway, it's great when you find a story like Wilding, which has so much sort of positive hope in it and real sort of genuine, you know, it's the real deal in terms of message and what's possible out there.
So let's talk about it. Let's talk about Wilding. I came to Wilding about only 6 months ago. I can't claim at all to have much of a knowledge of the landscape of farming in this country or anywhere else. But for one reason or another, I'm now thinking about it all the time, and you know, what it means to people's identities here and how it plays out what is happening in terms of ecotourism and what it means to have to pivot logistically, financially, psychologically. So when I read Wilding, I found it incredibly moving and, as you said, an amazing story and a really good point of access for somebody that doesn't really have much of a sense of what on earth has been going on in the last 100 years in this country. When did you come across it as a story?
I was making a film. I made a film with a great director friend of mine, Nick Brown, called Serengeti Rules, which is another feature doc on the subject. It arrives at the subject of rewilding through these very famous scientists, sort of unknown scientists' lives, recreating them as sort of as dramas, really, like 4 or 5 little dramas into a bigger piece. Which is really well worth watching. It's a beautiful film, and it absolutely sort of nails the big scientific discoveries about some of this stuff we're going to talk about, which is upgrading planet Earth through rewilding, and also sort of baseline shrink of the kind of environment degradation that we almost goes unnoticed because it just creeps away at just outside our sort of perception. But we made this film, and I knew Charlie and Izzy. I'd been walking around the estate of theirs with them 2 or 3 years earlier from that, or around the same time we were making the film. And we came to have the premiere launch in London of Serengeti Rules, and I really wanted to get this is global. Serengeti Rules is a global film. It goes from the Serengeti, it goes up to the very top of Alaska and the Aleutian Islands. It's sort of all these incredible stories about how nature works, really. And I really wanted to have a UK perspective on the concept of rewilding planet Earth. And Charlie and Izzy seemed the perfect people for it. So I got Charlie to come and do a Q&A at the end of the film. Rather than talk about Serengeti Rules, I wanted to talk about what it was like for us here in the UK to take some of these messages and use them. And they seem to be the most famous example of that. And it really sprang from there. Their project is extremely famous. It's been covered in every which way, in every kind of media. And Izzy's book, which is fantastic in its kind of weaving of narrative and really hardcore analytical fact giving, it's a sort of mixture of both, seems to be its genius in a way. But they then rang me up and said, we've had so many people come and want to tell our story and no one really seems to get it. And Passion and their team seems to understand all this. We'd really love you to come and have a look at this place and have a think about telling our story. So I sort of slightly trepidatiously went towards that because it's still a tough thing to tell. It's a long process by which, to a certain extent, not very much visually happens. There's no visual record of it. But I got sucked deeper and deeper into the idea of doing it, and our lovely foundation in America called Howard Hughes Medical Institute and Tangle Bank, who had helped us make Serengeti rules. But it was their project written by one of their guys that we made it for. They were very keen for us to pursue this. So together we had at it. And it went from there. But it definitely came from a level of what we call soft funding. So broadcasters weren't jumping off the bandwagon to try and get onto this project and pay the kind of money that needed to happen for it. So it was a slower process, that was for sure. But it just seemed like a fantastic a really great story of young couple inheriting this place, finding just normal agriculture on desperate land, just impossibly difficult, surviving simply by pouring chemicals and petrochemicals and subsidies into this to try and thrash it to death, to try and make something out of it. And their sort of slow realization to gamble everything on that sort of idea that they were going to do something completely different. And it was really different back then. It was a really unique idea. Certainly for a big landholder in the UK. So it just seems such a lovely idea to try and pull it off.
And speaking of long game plans, presumably you did have to spend a lot of time almost waiting for something to happen exciting enough that people would understand the excitement that Isabella obviously has when writing the book. And there are some amazing moments in it where they go out and they hear the birds song, and you know how things change for them in terms of their domestic life being surrounded by nature. But it's so subtle, and you know, you go there yourself and you sort of go through the doors of this incredible it's now a tourist attraction. You know, it's got this amazing center and a great shop and a lovely cafe, and you step out and it's like you're expecting to be in some kind of Disney safari. And it is what it is, and like you might see something and you might not, and you know there's this kind of anticipation that comes with Nep that must have you must have had to be there for quite a long time waiting for things to kind of happen. How long did it take?
I mean, we were there for years. We had a fantastic natural history cameraman called Simon de Glanville, who's brilliant, who lives in South London, is normally, you know, flying all over the world with all the big, you know, BBC Planet Earth productions and everything else, who was sort of, you know, very excited to do something at home in an area he loved, a book he loved. And he was out there a heck of a lot. He has his own little they have little buggies there that you can get around with, because the clay is almost impossible in the winter and it's a tough place to get around. And, you know, but almost sort of in his first 10 days of filming, we were out there, he filmed this extraordinary sequence of a pig, to, you know, for all intents and purposes, a completely domesticated pig, making this nest for its piglets, literally burrowing a hole, gathering its duvet of leaves, covering up the piglets for the night. Like, you know, you might film a wild pig in Borneo, or, you know, or a hog in Africa. It was just incredible. And those were just sort of wild instincts sort of coming out of nowhere. It was literally a domesticated pig released into their wild landscape. And it was a really touching moment that sort of fired us up for the rest of the filming big time. But a whole load of the film is trying to recreate that baseline shift in their story. And it's so we use a lot of drama reconstruction to sort of try and explain these moments of changing landscape, changing land use, and what sort of comes back to the estate.
And so much of it also is about their kind of psychological shift, and the trailer is fantastic because, you know, what's really exciting about the film, which I going to be seeing in London in when's the official launch date? Is it the 16th of June? I'm going to be seeing it I think in the evening of the 13th of June. And so the trailer for me spoke to the psychological shifts that were obviously very dramatic for them as a couple, and the lovely last scene of the trailer is them holding hands. And so the impression that one gets from the trailer is that this is as much a story about the sort of survival of human beings, of a marriage, of, you know, your sense of self. And there's this really amazing bit of the book which really jumped out at me, where Charlie takes a picture. He's taken a picture in the 80s, I guess, of his children sliding down or sitting in a massive mountain of grain that was kind of an excess of, you know, the more productive days that they had, as you say, when they were pumping loads of chemicals into it, and unbeknown to them was what was going to transpire in the decade to follow. And, you know, one can only imagine what that psychological journey must have been. And you're talking about the kind of natural instincts of these piggies. And I'm wondering, yeah, to what degree was this as much about them as individuals as it was for you about the landscape and the animals?
It really, I mean, it is. The story is very much about their awakening, about what we've lost all around us, and the madness of subsidies, chemical fertilizers, unsustainable practices, you know, and this other way of letting your land lie and creating. And I have to, and it is a fantastic journey in that sense of how they become more and more knowledgeable. You're sort of learning with them these connective processes that are joining up before your very eyes, in a way. And it's sort of running in a way, it's running on sort of two levels in terms of their human relationship story about what they're going to do with this farm and what they learn about it and what happens with this grand experiment. And the sort of process and potential of what rewilding can give us all, or give our land use management. What's really difficult with the film, we stay with this story, we stay with their journey, we stay with this grand experiment and its potential. With it comes a massive debate about farming, about rewilding, about where you do it, what you do with these. Where is it about making food, you know, sort of sustainability practices versus our need to be self-sufficient with food and everything. And that's a really difficult thing to get into, and certainly not for our film. And I think what is really important with the next stage is to realize that this, you know, posh couple who are incredibly privileged and had this huge, great estate, what they did with it was just simply a big experiment to see what's possible if you want to let aside the lost, forgotten, unsustainable, unfarmable pieces of landscape around this country for whatever reason. They can tell you, and they can debate long and hard, and they can, you know, you can read their books, and there's really good evidence to suggest we should be doing this in so many places all over the countryside. But that, it's not really about that. It's about what's possible if you need it. If you need this potential, what is the potential of rewilding for a piece of land that is either completely unsustainable for us to be utilizing it for food, or is just, you know, or it's just literally just, yeah, like I say, it's just not worth it. For the amount of money and resources you're pouring onto a land that just can't be sustained in that way. And with that in mind, it just becomes this extraordinary, powerful, sort of hopeful possibilities of of places that you might want to do something different to, in a world that we kind of so need to repair in some sense, in so many places. Yeah, I've lost where I was going.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thank you. This is exactly the point I am trying to make throughout all of the interviews that I'm having or conversations I'm having on this podcast. The purpose of my business, Frances Fogel Story Strategist, is to help people who are sitting on gold mines of stories, because they are custodians of physical spaces, be they farmland or a pub somewhere in London or the southeast of England, because I had to start somewhere, to have the hope, bravery, strength, decisiveness to kind of pivot something that has been going on in the way that it has on their land and in their business for some time, either because they have chosen that or they've inherited it because they need to for financial reasons, because it's not making any sense to carry on as it is, or because they want to do something differently from a point of philosophical point of view or an ethical point of view, and to have the strength to make a change, or indeed they have made a change. And what they are not doing well enough is telling the story. And the story matters for 4 reasons, is how I describe it. If you can tell a story well, as everybody knows, you can sell more stuff. And that's mainly how storytelling is being used in marketing and sales and branding. But if you just do it in silo, and you don't use the same story, which is really powerful, in 3 other ways, then you're cutting off your nose to spite your face. And those 3 other ways, as far as I'm concerned, are how to make your people feel more significant, as Seth Godin might say, and more belonging to your project, how to keep your customers more loyal and, you know, coming back for more, but sharing the good word and cheerleading what you're doing, and to do better in society and to show up as a citizen as opposed to just doing your thing. And so you can use a good story to do those 4 things. And rather than working with people in silo across those 4 things, it makes so much sense to work in a way that allows you to tell the same story in a number of different ways. And I think that's what you're talking about. It's using a story, holding gently, compassionately, safely, creatively the people who the story belongs to, and sort of allowing them slowly to tell it and, you know, to understand what it means to them, and then to repurpose it into something that is meaningful in terms of convincing others they can do something like it, bringing people to that place and being forgiving at worst and completely celebratory at best about what they've achieved, to make others feel that they need to cheerlead it and how they can cheerlead it by way of a good story, and to, yes, to kind of inspire others to do something similar. And that's what the film represents to me. That's why I'm excited about this film. And it's one thing having the book. It's another thing someone coming along and saying, let's capitalize on this yet again in another, you know, through another storytelling vehicle. And we talk about I run a community as well called Better, Bolder, Braver, which is designed to help people helpers to put themselves out there with greater clarity, confidence, and joy, often in storytelling. We talk about watch, read, listen, and do, and people's differing approaches to learning. And it feels to me like there's a responsibility in the work that you do in the film Wilding and in all the other films that you've directed. And that's why I originally asked you about your kind of personal motivations and your bigger picture system change, because some people don't know how to read books, or don't read books, or don't get inspired by books. And yeah, film seems a really important medium in this conversation about conservation. And it's interesting to me. I think we're at the cusp of something great. In, you know, I think it's exemplified by the fact that green energy is becoming actually more cost effective than fossil fuels, because suddenly people are starting to say this makes sense to us financially, and also it's palatable. We're in it together, and if we work together, it won't feel so lonely and we don't need to feel so anxious. So hence my question to you about, you know, to what degree people's reception of some of the more difficult themes in your work is present in your directing.
Yeah, I think absolutely. It's so often all about difficult themes in, you know, in what we're trying to get across, and there's always a message. I mean, I think the Wilding story, outside of being a kind of a classic human drama of two people stepping into the unknown, going through extreme levels of adversity to get through to this, just get to the end of their quest. There's a sort of, what's really underlying is a sort of is the story of the soil that they're standing on, which seems to me such a revelation. It was such a revelation to me, for sure, who's supposed to know all about this stuff, but the level to which the land on which we're looking around us has been just at a creeping baseline level, been turned pretty much to sand, which we can pour petrochemicals onto and magically produce food out of, and to the detriment of everything else, to our clean water, to our biodiversity, to everything. And even if that was acceptable in back in the day, it's not even practical now, just by the sheer cost and you know, effect that basically pouring petrochemicals all over our land does, you know. So there has to be another way, sustainably, by definition, unless you want to just make a shit ton of money off your field for 10, 15, 20, 50 years, and then turn it into dust and do it by sucking out a lot of oil out of the ground. There has to be another way for a lot of these places. And this is that slow realization of what soil is, what soil can be, how soil can work without just being a medium in which to, you know, pour fertilizers and try and grow industrialized crops on. So it's and to make a film about soil and earthquake quantity and how it repairs itself and regenerates. I mean, that's really tough without a fantastic story like this. And that is so much what their story is about. And you can translate that wherever you look, certainly in our world, you know. So I think it's that wonder and revelation, to find a story with that kind of important revelation staring us right under our noses is gold dust for sure. For sure.
And there's something also about the message that it's almost so wonderful, it may well not be what you can achieve. And I'm thinking about the amount of people I know who are really pivoting their land into something quite different. So, you know, they're getting really busy with the glamping stuff, festivals, and they're kind of embracing new uses of land and new ways of bringing their land into communities, which, you know, previously have been so cut off. You know, so many things are being addressed at the moment in terms of inclusivity and diversity and blending of different people from different backgrounds. And it actually might be the case for a number of people who have farmed previously on their land, that isn't actually the best use of it. And this film is inspirational both for those who might like to rewild if they can, physically and sort of financially and psychologically go there, but it might be that isn't actually what they should do, and it's okay, and there's other ways and there's other stories that people can have. And I think a lot of it is about those what we might call shadow stories, is the less beautiful, the less shiny, the less ideal outcomes, and the kind of hard work that can be done that doesn't necessarily lead to where you thought it was going to lead. And, you know, when I look around at amazing film producers, particularly, who are like having to capture reality, and you do animation, and there is something to be said for how you can create something out of nothing. But, you know, presumably in your world, you've had to reconcile many times when things haven't gone your way, they haven't gone to the plot, they haven't, you know, you just haven't been able to capture something that you really hoped you would. And then you've had to pivot yourself as a director and just change direction, and the stories had to change, right? And how does that feel for you?
Mm. Mm. And are you saying that they've had to do that, or that how you mean, or people having to look at their land use, they have to do that to
I think,
reappraise their land?
yeah, I think there are people who are looking at Isabella Tree as, you know, and Charlie as the kind of pinnacle of hope of what might be achieved if you are to take a percentage of land and do some rewilding on it. And there's some really exciting like ecotourism and business development opportunities there, as you can bring people to the land who would not otherwise be interested to come. There's ways of involving community in those projects. But there's also a reality that, you know, for the reasons that you discuss around soil, or, you know, around privilege and not being able to kind of necessarily make that happen in the time scale that you need to give it, you know, people have to consider that it might not be for them. Or, you know, how much can they do and still do farming? And, you know, there's all these very interesting conversations going on, where if Isabella Tree and NEP is a kind of ultimate example of success, you know, it might be that, in fact, most cases are that people will have to fall somewhere in the middle of that and work out a combination of how much of it might make sense for them and what else are they going to do. And there's a great deal of creativity there, and comfort with the unknown, and hope, which is kind of a metaphor for, I think, how we're all having to navigate climate change and these net zero targets, because what we might like to do now isn't necessarily what's going to come out the wash. And I guess my work is about how storytelling can help you kind of move forward, and if the narrative changes, how that's all right, basically, is what I think I'm trying to say here.
Mm-hmm. And I think the narrative is changing. I mean, certainly in the terms of farming, the narrative has changed dramatically. And so, you know, I think people's moving beyond the grand experiment of the NEP estate, which I don't think is the ultimate form of success. It's just a really beautifully laid out, scientifically correctly laid out with a baseline study and everything else. It's a grand experiment that shows you a way you can just what happens with a particular piece of land. But I think we do have to reappraise. I don't think it's necessarily for people with, not many of us are going to have anything like a bit of land that we can do this with, but we do have to ask questions about what we expect of our land. And if people want to know how does it work financially? Well, it doesn't necessarily, but nor does farming in so many questions. So as long as you're very au fait about how much your taxpayers subsidizing money and how much the polluting levels of the petrochemicals that are going on and what the cost of all that, as long as you're au fait with that on any bit of land around you, then you can understand what the finances whether they make sense or not. And as long as you understand, the changing face of that in terms of what is possible and sustainable, then I think you have to start looking, at looking at new ways of dealing with the land we live off, for sure. And I think, often it just doesn't make sense to grow food just for the sake of growing food when we're paying large amounts of money and we're destroying the world around us to do it, when we just don't need to be doing it in certain circumstances. You've just got to look at each one of these things on its own merits.
I think what you're doing with the film and what the book does is, in the nicest possible way, smack people in the face who are not willing or not able to take bad and to hold pain. And yes, there'll be people who will turn something off because it's unpleasant, and so the funding doesn't come readily. And yet there's people like yourself who are continuing to put stuff out there because it's the public perception of what needs to happen that needs to change, because the public perception means that there'll be individuals who'll be incentivized to do something about it themselves. But it'll also be, as you say, that more people will be more invested in what government funding does and will hold to account the companies that they bank with, where their pension is, who they vote for, when they understand better the situation. And I'm thinking about my theatre studies background from 20 years ago, and we were taught about the difference between Brechtian theatre and naturalistic theatre, where Brechtian theatre is about incentivizing the audience to get off their arses and do something about it, and how important it was to create a sense of alienation from the drama, so that you don't just walk into the cinema or walk into the theatre, really immerse yourself in the narrative and in the story, but leave thinking that's someone else's story and there's nothing I need to do. Because the art is to produce something that is so beautiful as you have. Well, I haven't seen it yet, but I can tell from the trailer that it's going to be. But at the same time, invite the audience to reconsider their position on the subject and make it more palatable. And I've had personal conversations with people that I am really surprised have taken beef, if you'll forgive the pun, with the concept of rewilding and sort of how it massively offends so many people in this country and what they've been working towards for generations. And how dare people like we, who know nothing about farming and never owned a farm, how dare we have an opinion about something we know nothing about, and that we need to get back in our boxes and get on with our city life. And, you know, to kind of move the dial, or to be to be allowed to have an opinion as somebody who has not owned farmland, is as much part of this whole mission, as far as I see it. And it's why I am so honored to have the chance to talk to you, because I just thought he's gotta, whether he knows it or not, he is part of this really important change mission that's going on. And without people like you, and without the book, and without the film, it's going to be a really tough ride to get most people in this country on board with what needs to change. Hence my questions. How much of that is what moves you to do this work?
I think telling the good story is what really moves me. I mean, I do have a mission for it, but it's the story side of it, which you're talking about, which is, I find incredibly attractive when you find a story that does that kind of enlightenment. There's such a joy to do that, and to do that well. It's a fabulous confluence of everything one wants when one finds a book like Izzy's that can really give a revelatory way about looking at the world that is genuinely changes the way you see everything, and really, really useful. But I totally understand, you know, ingrained farming traditions are gonna, and you know, I can't, you know, it really depresses me that it's becoming polarized onto a rewilding and a farming existence. It's just not, you know, we need farming to grow food for us in all the right ways, in all the right places. And there are so many unsuitable, lost and forgotten parts of this world that we need to set about rewilding super fast. And then in that little middle ground, we need to start looking at, does it make sense to be farming this? Are you actually spending more money than you're getting? Are you as a society just doing it because you've been doing it for hundreds of years, but actually it's costing much, much more to the planet and to your pocket than it would ever make sense to do? Is there another way? You've just got to ask that question all the time in all walks of life. And that's all the rewilding movement is doing. They are not trying to stop farming across the country. There's no point in that. We understand but there's a lot of senseless agricultural use going on at the moment, that is short-term gain, for profit and for nothing else, and not for the good of any of us.
And you can understand where it comes from. I mean, I think in Isabella's book, she talks about the message that was loud and clear coming from the government to dig for victory after the war. And it was really important that as many people as possible made as good a use as they understood it at the time of their land. So it's no one's fault that things have evolved the way that they have. And that's the point, is that if things change, it's not a criticism or, reprimanding of things gone by. But it's being able to say, let's change. And it's, I want to be part of that change.
And it's quite an alien place when you go there. It's like thorny, weird animal tracks everywhere. It's more like being in Africa. It's not, it's really not. And there is, we all have this, I think, an innate desire to cut to the horizon, to, order things. And it's so scraggly and thorny and seemingly unloved that it does offend. And she talks brilliantly about that, and they used to do tours around with people, and the only generation of the people who understood it all was the pre-war generation that had seen all these thorny, scraggy areas for that was just sort of part of the norm, that we've just sort of clear cut out of our lives, and we think it's all supposed to be sort of ordered and gathered, which of course it isn't.
And this is just, again, entirely appropriate, given that we've been brought up, post-industrial revolution. And my other background is art history. And I remember being taught that where Turner was really embracing industrial revolution and painting paintings like Rain, Steam and Speed with trains and viaducts, and really embracing what the landscape was changing into, you had people like Constable sitting at the top of Hampstead Heath, which of course had been, to quite a large degree urbanized by then, and painting the Haywain and sort of harking back to this pastoral idyll prior, pre-industrial revolution. And all through history, people's perceptions of what beautiful is, what beauty represents, are being challenged in literature and film and art. And I love what you're saying there, that that the kind of neglect in a way is offensive, almost as if you're criticizing. I'm a mother, and so when you first have babies and everyone has an opinion about how you should be bringing up your children, it's that sense of, gosh, you can't neglect them. And it's offensive to think that you don't just fully nurture everything to the nth degree. I love the parallel you're making there, and I'm going to have to think more about that, because I think it's spot on. But we're nearly at time. I'd love to know what you've made of this conversation, because you're probably speaking to a lot of people ahead of the launch of the film. It's a great privilege to have this opportunity to talk to you. But yeah, is there anything that's come out of it that's been of particular interest to you?
No, it's always interesting how the conversation turns to the bigger picture. This is really trying to be a wonderful narrative of this journey. It's supposed to have a feature length and a feature pace. And I think it's so interesting how the topic gravitates to the bigger, everyone's attitude to the bigger picture, which we found very difficult to deal with in the film in terms of storytelling. You're either telling the story of this experiment and this couple, or you getting into a sort of a debate, discussion around rewilding versus agriculture, which is absolutely not where we wanted to go. But it's amazing.
What I'm hearing is that you're defending story for story's sake. and that it's okay to have a really great story and for it not to necessarily mean that you're on a pedestal. Is that right?
I guess I'm just saying, story of story's sake when you come to it, but it's interesting how when you take a really great story around a much bigger subject that everyone feels they have their own investment or opinion of, it's very difficult to separate the two. And it'll be interesting to see how much people feel frustrated by that or enlightened by it, you know. I know definitely I've seen, I've talked to people coming out to screenings saying, yeah, but how do they afford that? Or how we can't do that around the world. And, you know, there's an instant reaction to how do we roll it out? How does it, why can they do it and we can't or whatever, which is maybe we should have addressed somehow more in the DNA of the film, but we tried desperately to do so. But I think it's part of people's reaction to their norm is to sort of say, oh, very well for you, but let's get back to our normal lives. But it'll be interesting, you know, in the world of Jeremy Clarkson's farm and this, I think they're both talking very similar spaces at the end of the day. They've got very similar messages, it seems, and you know, because at the end of the day, Clarkson's showing how tough it is to farm and how much is going into it and how much nitrogen he needs to pour onto his farm and everything else. So it's all informing the same thing as this very romantic story. They're all coming to the same kind of places. We need to look at how we deal with our landscape use anew.
What I'm going to try as a result of this conversation to do when I watch the film, and also I think you're doing a Q&A afterwards at the Curzon,
right,
is to try to not just do what I do, which is to read it, use it, talk about it as a linchpin for a big picture system change, but just to appreciate it as well as a beautiful story. And yeah, I've really appreciated this time with you because
right. I think that's exactly right. I think it's right. People think it's going to be exactly. I think that's exactly a good, that I'd like that. I think that's right. We were certainly making it in that vein, but we didn't realize quite how contentious a subject it was. You know, so someone like BBC are very worried about the film and whether they would ever screen it because it's, you know, they consider this a very polarized subject, which has to, you know, needs both sides of the opinion put, and you've got to put agriculture beside rewilding and all the rest of it.
Yeah. Well, look, if I cheerlead it, when I cheerlead it, I will do so from the viewpoint now of some deeper, having been illuminated on a deeper level as to what these films can serve us. And I think in an age where we are so inclined to be binary or have an opinion or feel like we need to sit on one side of the fence or another, there's moments of hope that simply we don't, and we can actually just enjoy it and stop giving ourselves such a hard time about being here or there at the end of it, and actually just be grateful for this gift of someone's experience as seen through the eyes of someone who's able to capture it. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. It sounds exactly right.
Good. And thank you for your time, and in advance thank you for the film. And I think I speak on behalf of many of us, whether we know anything about the subject or not, because it's going to be a gift. So thank you.
Great.
Thanks everyone.
All right. Take care.
And you.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.